So what exactly are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to go ahead and make sure that we all understand what exactly an action is. You may have heard of dynamic actions, and I just want to clear it up right away that we are not talking about dynamic actions in this talk. There's actually a completely separate interface that allows you to register actions that you can invoke programmatically. We're going to discover how to add and register those actions to a page, and not only to an entire page, but maybe to a specific component. A way that I see actions used to great success is when trying to consolidate pages that maybe have dozens of buttons on the top of the page or along the side of the page, and maybe we want to consolidate those buttons into one kind of drop-down menu. The other thing is to consider is that we want to make sure that we're still using as many declarative features as possible. And one of the main reasons for that is to make sure that we're actively making use of security. It's likely that you have authorization schemes that should tie into different actions that a user may or may not be able to perform. So we want to take that into consideration. And then lastly, we're going to talk about a way that you can improve the user's ability to invoke actions by using shortcuts. And we'll also talk about different ways of presenting feedback to the user to let them know that they are actively entering a shortcut, or maybe sometimes, depending on the number of shortcuts that are available, you don't want to necessarily provide immediate feedback because it might get in the way. So first, what is an action? And an action really it's very similar to a function. It performs a specific task. And in order for that task to actually execute or do what is assigned to it, we need to invoke that action. And it turns out that Apex does have this documented. And I will hop over to my browser here for just one moment. And I'm currently in the JavaScript documentation. We're currently looking at Apex version 21.1, but you can see that there are all sorts of different methods that you could invoke on an action. And the one that I think is particularly helpful is invoke. And I'm not here to read through all this documentation with you. I'm just going to show you that this is the interface that we will be working on, apex.actions. But if you want to read more, there is the application has a link to the Apex documentation, and we will be making the application available at the end of the presentation. So what types of actions might we want to perform, or how might we want to interface with an action? Well, one of the most common ones I would say is a button, just something that you click on that performs some action. We might want to have a radio control or a select list. Maybe there's several options that the user could toggle between. And then if there's only two actions or two states that you want to swap or flip-flop back and forth between, such as maybe hiding or showing, enabling, disabling, those types of actions, then it is totally possible to create a toggle action. How do we make sure that this action is available to our page? Well, we need to make sure that we register that action, and we're going to use the add API. And there's really one piece, or I guess two pieces of information that you have to provide to an action. You need to give it a name. In database terms, that's a lot like a primary key. How do we identify this action? So it's got to be something unique. And then we must have some sort of action property or a function that's going to do some amount of work. An example of what this might look like is we'll call apex actions.add. And we have a name, which is our primary key, our label, which is essentially some sort of display value that we're going to show the end user. And then we have an action that we can associate. And I just want to point out a couple things about an action. And that is, it takes in an event object and a focus element. Suffice to say that some actions may require additional information, such as how exactly was this action invoked. And then the focus element is typically used for after the action has resolved or performed whatever the task is. At the end of the action, that focus element is what's going to be targeted, or at least we may want to do that. So let's actually look at one of these actions in action. So we can see on this page, there are a couple different things going on. We have some button actions, and based on the outline that I just showed you a moment ago, we have the alert action, which basically just says this is an action. Now, this obviously is not too exciting, but I want to kind of demonstrate the plumbing that went in to registering this alert. So if I go in and I edit my page, I have this add call that is registering an alert action, and it has a function that it's invoking. It's using the Apex message namespace just quite simply to provide an alert. Oh, and I should mention, just for the sake of the webinar, if you have any questions, there is a Q&A box that you can post your questions into, and Lena will be helping address those questions for me. Notice that I have two other methods that I'm adding here. We have a success action and an error action. They do slightly different things. The success action shows the page success message, and the error action shows an error message in the upper right-hand corner. Let me go ahead and demonstrate those for you now. We already did the alert. So if I click on success, we'll get a success message in the upper right-hand corner. And if I click on the error, we get the error message in the upper right-hand corner. If I want to call one of those actions, as you just saw, I needed to use the invoke action, or the invoke method, part of the API, and we have to make sure that we provide a valid name. And in this case, we have apex.actions.invoke. What is that, or how do I actually execute those lines of code? Well, simply enough, if I come to my console, I can say apex actions.invoke, and I can pass in, that might be a little bit small, let's make this a little bit bigger. I can pass in the name of the action that I've registered. So in this case, I'll say alert. And we can see that we get the action invoked. And then conversely, or similarly, I can say success, or I could say error, and the corresponding messages show up.
Tyson, sorry for jumping in, just a quick one.
Yep.
Do you know since when is actions available in Apex? Which version did it come in?
It has been around for a very long time. So definitely before Apex 5. So if you're on a really old version of Apex, it might not be available, but I don't know the exact version number, but it's definitely not a new thing.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, this should be applicable to virtually any instance. If you're in the universal theme, you should be safe. How do we actually map those actions to a UI control? Just a moment ago, you saw me click on a button and then it performed a canned alert. And depending on how the action is meant to be, how the user is meant to interact with this action, we need to make sure that we pick the appropriate control for our users. And in this case, I want to register a button on my screen that will invoke an action. And there's a couple important pieces of information that we have to know about when we do this. And the two important pieces of information is that we need to add a class JS action button. This tells Apex to kind of initialize this component as a button that is going to invoke an action. And then notice there's a very special property that we can provide here called data action. And notice the name that I'm associating with this is alert. So in this case, when I click this button, it is going to invoke the alert action. Let's actually go ahead and see how we can do this in kind of declaratively in Apex. I'm going to go ahead and use the quick edit functionality from using my developer toolbar. And I'm going to edit this region. Now, one of the things that you might notice about my buttons here is that, let me pop this open. All I have done is I added the class JS action button, and I've added the action alert. So this kind of wires those components together. There's no actual event handler that I need to register with this. Apex takes care of a lot of that behind the scenes for me. It's also possible that I might want to do this in a more declarative way. So if I go back and I run my page and I go to quick edit and I go to this button up here in the upper right hand corner, let's have a view and see what that looks like. We can see that it is indeed a button that's been added to my page. It's a normal button. It's very easy to discover. The typical Apex developer would be able to locate this and see the metadata, and it would make sense. And if we scroll down through, we can see that the CSS class being added to this button is called JS action button. We are saying that the behavior is defined by a dynamic action. Now, I want to clear up a bit of confusion that sometimes happens here. When you select the action defined by dynamic action, really what that means is that the button itself isn't going to do anything, or the button isn't aware of what its action is supposed to be. Something somewhere else in the application is going to tell this button what it should do. So really, it's kind of like just making a button that does nothing. Now, if I scroll down just a little bit more, we can see that under the custom attribute section, we can see that the data action attribute is being applied. So this is kind of the more declarative way of creating a button on the screen. Now, this is kind of nice because why would I want to pick a declarative button versus trying to write all of the HTML myself? Well, remember that we want to let Apex generate as much HTML as possible, and kind of we want Apex to do all the heavy lifting wherever we can. We might have some sort of checkbox that we would like to use. In this case, the class that we add, it's still action button, but the input type is going to be a checkbox. And in this case, I have an action by the name of toggle region. So I'd like to go ahead and show you what exactly that does. Demo 2. Here you can see I have a checkbox on my screen. And if I select it, it is currently active, and we see that this region is displayed based on the toggle state. And if I uncheck it, you can see that it goes away. What exactly does the toggle region action look like? Well, let's go find it. Well, there are a couple things that I want to talk about in this code. And one of the things that you'll notice is that we have the toggle region, which is something that needs to be selected off of the page. And quite simply, I'm just using a jQuery selector to go get that region, and I'm holding on to that region. The actual toggle region action, you can see that it's looking to see if we have some sort of focus element or not. In this case, the focus element is the checkbox. It's passed in automatically by Apex, and I'm checking to see whether or not that focus element is checked. So if it exists and it is checked, then it will show the region. Otherwise, it will hide the target region. And I want to be clear here. Notice that I did not provide the region that should be toggled when this was invoked. So this is something that I had to register beforehand. There was some existing state that my action was able to reference. So it's very common that you will have a part of your application that will kind of initialize states and go find components and kind of register them to be used by your actions. And this makes sense when you think about kind of what's the purpose of these actions? Really, it's to control a user interface based on security or conditions, whether or not something should display or not. We want a lot of that logic to be controlled by Apex, and we will initialize the focus on those particular components kind of one time at the very beginning of our page. But depending on your requirements, that might need to change. The other thing to point out is that I immediately am invoking this toggle region because I want to make sure that this page initializes correctly. So if it just so happens that that region is rendered in a checked state, then it would make sure that it shows the region it's supposed to be toggling. So it just kind of keeps my page in sync with what's going on. And the other option that I want to take a look at is when we have multiple choice. And this is similar between radio groups and select lists. And one thing that I want to point out is that the class here is JS action select. And notice that the data action that it's using, it says get employee Sal. Okay, so I'm guessing in this case, I'm probably going to have a select list that has employees. Maybe I'm going to be passing in an employee number based on what I've selected. And then I need to go fetch some information that relates to that employee number. How do we do it? Well, let's first go ahead and take a look at the select list, or let's watch it. Let's observe what happens, and then we'll start to pick it apart. So here I have a minimally formatted select list. It kind of stands out a bit in that it doesn't look like a normal select list, or this is just a standard HTML select list formatted the way that Firefox thinks it should look. And I can select King, and we can see that King's salary is retrieved. If I select Clark, you can see that Clark's salary is retrieved and set to this item. Okay, well, what exactly happened there? Well, I'm gonna go ahead and quick edit. And at this point, I just want to show you that I have explicitly gone through and I have registered a select list. I want you to pay close attention to the fact that there are currently no options inside of this select list. So how exactly does this select list get its choices or get the values that are provided to it? I'm going to go ahead and scroll down just a bit more here. We did our toggle region. And now we have the ability for us to, we're going to look at this particular action. And so we can see here, get employee salary. And we have a display salary. There are some choices that can potentially be made. So these choices are basically what's available to this particular action. We can either say none, we're not selecting an employee, or there might be some employee value that we can pick from. Now, immediately kind of combing through this, I can see that it doesn't appear that my choices have all been properly initialized in this location. Well, if I scroll down just a bit more, we can see that there's a function here called get employee choices. And I just want to take a look at what's going on. Get employee choices is a function that's going to talk to the database. And it's going to query some information. It's going to get all of the employees that are in my system, potentially adhering to any security rules that need to be applied. Not every employee needs to see, not every employee needs to be an available option. Maybe if I'm a manager, I can only see my employees, something like that. The other thing that I want to point out is that I was able to I have my action name here, which is get employee sal. And notice that I'm using the Apex Actions lookup to actually retrieve all of the metadata that relates to that action. One of the pieces of information that is important to this action are the available choices that can be made. What I'm going to do is I'm going to iterate over all of the choices that were returned back from the server, and I am going to add all of those choices to this action. Now, one important thing to note is that Apex will not automatically re-render a component. To force Apex to re-render a component to show any new choices that might be available, we need to invoke this update choices method, and notice that we give it the action name. So if I didn't make it clear before, I'm going to make it clear now. It's very likely that you're going to need to provide the action name to do something. And again, you can think of it like a primary key. Well, how is it that I was able to get this response? Like, what exactly is going on here? I don't want to go too off topic on this, but I just want to show you exactly how this was built. So there's some dependency between my action and some other methods on my page. If we dig a little bit deeper, there's this method here called get employee choices. And ultimately, it's a function that's been defined, and it's invoking this business here, Apex server process get employee choices. Well, that's interesting. Well, how do I know what get employee choices mean? Well, I would encourage you to take a look at the Apex server API. It allows you to make AJAX requests to communicate with the back end of a system and get information. Well, let's take a look at what exactly get employee choices is doing and where that's defined. There's a special place where we can actually define these methods. And if I come here to processing, we can see that we have this special area here called AJAX callback. Suffice to say that this is something that is not going to execute in the standard lifecycle of an Apex page. In fact, if my user never interacted with the page, then it would these methods would never be invoked. And we were interested in get employee choices. Let's take a look at what this looks like. In this case, we can see that I am using the Apex JSON package. I'm opening an array. I'm selecting data. This is a relatively small data set, so I am using a cursor for loop. Always, take performance into consideration whenever you're writing something. And all I'm doing is I am writing back an object, which is a label and a value. And the label is the employee name. That's what my user cares about. And the value is my employee number. That's what my system cares about. Interesting. So therefore, when we go all the way back to the very beginning, when we say get employee choices, it's going to read in all of those labels, all of those employee names and employee numbers, and associate them with that get employee sal action that I've defined. Okay, we'll go ahead and cancel this. So I just want to point out again the declarative mapping of how we were able to map a component to we were to declaratively create a button and then map it to an action that we've registered. We added the JS action button class, and we added the custom attribute data action, and we mapped it to whatever action is supposed to be invoked. It should be noted that defined by dynamic action is the behavior that we would specify for a button. So how exactly do we want to respond to these user interactions? So if it's expected that we're going to click on something, we'll probably go ahead and use an action button, such as give raise. Is there a specific value that we're looking for that we might need to make some sort of decision? Well, we might want to use something like a radio group, so we can, as we set the value, so for example, font size, if we want a small font size or if we want a large font size, we would pick that option. And maybe we'd have several font sizes in between, so there's a scale that we can pick from. Or if there's just two states or two options, either it's on or it's off, a lot like a light switch. So the UI now is no longer tightly coupled to functionality. In fact, it's the action that performs the behavior. So it's easy for us to move around the user interface, add buttons, remove buttons, and we can invoke these actions as needed by our different controls. The other thing that I see that's very helpful, oops, We went warp speed. The other thing that I see is very helpful with actions is consolidating our screen. So I want to make sure that my user, or one user interface that I've seen a number of times, and it happens with a lot of Apex applications, is that you want to add features to your application. You want your user to be able to give a raise or terminate an employee or change the department of an employee. And there's some workflow or something that's going to be invoked based on that selection. I've seen it where the buttons container at the top of the screen just gets completely filled with buttons. And so one way that we can solve that, I'm not saying this is the only way, but it's one way, is that we can use a menu pop-up. And if I click on this, just to show you, there is a tutorial here in the universal theme sample application, which will walk you through how to create a button that looks like this. And this is one of the things where actually I recently saw on Twitter, someone was asking if this can be made more declarative. I mean, or more discoverable, I guess. It actually is fairly declarative, but there's all these little steps that you have to kind of hop through to get everything wired up and working. And I would agree with that. I think that would be a welcome addition to Apex. So this is something that I think I've used in virtually every application that I've built in recent years. So how do we do it? Let me show you an example of what I'm talking about and how we solve it. So what I'd like to point out is at the top of the screen, this isn't too out of hand, but we can see that we can see where this is headed. We have a cancel, delete, give raise, change department, and apply changes. And we have this middle section, which normally this is the area that will start to grow, and you'll get more actions and more actions and more actions. I've seen users change these from text buttons to be just icon buttons, and that works pretty well. But then if you have more actions starting to be added, well then, how do we consolidate this? So to be fair, when I click on give raise, it says gave raise to King. And when I click on change dep, you can see here it says change King's department. Well, what exactly happened, and how can I potentially make this a menu? Well, if we look at these buttons, we can see that it's just a normal submit button, nothing fancy going on. Okay, so is there a way that I can make this, so how can I make a submit button kind of relate to an action? Well, I'm gonna go ahead and swap this over to a toggle. I'm gonna toggle my menu. And you'll notice that my buttons in the middle of the screen have kind of gone away. And now I have a dropdown. This dropdown allows me to give a raise as well as change the department. And if I say give raise, I should get my give raise success message. And if I say change department, I get my change King's department. Now, obviously that should invoke maybe a dialogue or a modal or something to kind of walk the user through that workflow, but that's not really what we're going to discuss now. We're just kind of talking about the entry point. Well, how did I do this? Well, it turns out that if I edit my page and I scroll down, at the bottom of my screen, I have a menu actions list. So if we look here, we can see that the type is a list. The list source is page actions. And we've also put it in the inline dialogues position. Basically, what it means to be in the inlines dialog position is that it's not going to be visible by default. If I go to my attributes, the list template that I'm using is menu popup. And there's an important piece of information that I want to point out here, which is I did use the add actions method here, or the add actions template option. So that's what kind of makes my actions available. But how did I associate this menu with my button? Well, if I go back to my button, and I think it's actions here, you can see that I've given it a CSS class, JS menu button, and I've given it a custom attribute of data menu, actions menu. And basically what this does is this will allow my button to be registered to that list that was created just a moment ago. Now, what's the advantage of doing something like this? Well, it turns out that if I go to my shared components, my page actions are declaratively kind of associated with the page, so it's very easy for me to figure out, well, which actions are being made available. And if I edit these actions, I just want to show you. Notice that there are actually 3 actions that are made available. One of them is checking whether or not I am currently an admin. So I actually didn't see that third option. So the other reason why I'd want to use this is for security. How do I toggle or change my security? Well, I'm going to say toggle security. And then now there's a terminate action that becomes available. Previously, that wasn't an option. I could say terminate and then terminated king. Now, obviously, I don't want anybody to be able to do that, right? And I want to make sure that only authenticated users even see that option.
Tyson, let me jump in real quick. This is Dave. A couple of questions in the queue. Where was that add actions option located? Was it in the template of the inline dialog?
Great question. So, how do we register these actions? So, suffice to say, what happened is that I'm at the page level. So I'm editing my page component. And if I go to JavaScript, there should be an area for me, execute when page load, and this is where I would put that code. I'm kind of on the wrong page at the moment, so let me go back to actions and edit page 2. And you can see here, execute when page loads. I am registering all of my actions here. And important thing to note is that when I say execute when page loads, this will make sure that all of my UI controls that I might depend on are present. And so if I'm initializing a button or a region or something that I might need to toggle, it's important that I do this when the page loads so I can actually get a handle to that component.
Wasn't there also a declarative checkbox for add actions?
So if I have gone through this work to kind of register these actions, it is possible that I can go to template options and there is a template option where I can say add actions, but it does require me to do a little bit of work on my end first. But I'm not going to dive too deep into that part at the moment.
Fair enough. Well, one other. So what's the advantage or difference of using an action like this rather than the conventional dynamic actions?
Great. So we might have a similar action that needs to be used across several different pages, or maybe you're a developer that's coming more from a web-based development background. You're comfortable writing JavaScript. You're comfortable writing HTML and CSS. This might be more in line with your skill set, and now you kind of have a little bit more control over exactly how things are going to happen. The other thing that I would say is that the way that I've implemented this, I'm just putting this on one page. It's totally possible that I could put this in a JavaScript file and just link it to my page, and I can link it maybe to several different pages. And I could reuse these actions, not just in this app, but maybe across several different applications. The implementation would be a little bit different, but the general emphasis is on reuse.
Great. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, you bet. So when it comes to enforcing security, the declarative options are going to be the best, because I can defer to a list component, pull in any options that might be needed, and enforce any security that might be needed. The other thing that I want to add to this is that I want to allow my users to invoke these actions without necessarily having to click around the user interface. One example that you may or may not be aware of is in the application builder. This is used to great effect. And I'd like to go ahead and just demonstrate a couple of shortcuts for you that I use in my daily development of Apex. Check this out. So typically speaking, when I'm on a page and I want to go somewhere else, what I'll do is I'll just press Control quote, and this little search pops up, and I want to navigate to page 3, so I'll just search for 3, and then I'll go to the consolidate buttons and press enter. Part of that was you could do things like that by using shortcuts. Maybe I'm on my help area here, and I want to toggle back to my layout region because I want to add a new component. Well, I'd like everyone to kind of focus in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. I'm going to go ahead and do Control quote or Control /, and Apex is providing me feedback saying, hey, you entered a key or part of a shortcut, but it didn't uniquely resolve to a particular action. So I'm going to go ahead and press G, and that means I'd like to open my component gallery, and I'll show you what that is in a moment. And not only do I want to open my component gallery, but I want to open it for my regions, or R. So I'm going to press R. So immediately the builder focuses on it selects the layout tab, and then expands this drawer at the bottom of the screen and focuses regions. Now, notice that I have several different options: regions, items, and buttons. And I'm just going to show you here, Control/G I for items, Control/G B for buttons, and I can add these components to my layout if I wanted to. Interesting. So how is Apex able to do that, and how am I able to do that in my applications? So one of the things that I've done is that I have registered a shortcut display, just a handle to a potential item, and I'm just injecting a div onto my page. Nothing too fancy there. There is under the actions interface, there's a special function that we can override called partial shortcut input. And it will accept in a parameter called key sequence. Apex will provide this for you. You don't need to do anything with that. The last thing that we're going to do is we're going to detect if we currently have a key sequence or not. Then we're going to, if we do have a key sequence, then we're going to make it fully opaque. And then if we do not have a key sequence, then we're going to make it not opaque, or instead we're going to make it transparent. And we're also going to make sure that we update the text of our div to actually show the current sequence. How do we do that? Well, here we go. Adding shortcuts. So I always want to point out my actions menu now actually has Control/U R, U T, and U D. And so now if I do Control/, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, I'm providing feedback, and then I'll say U because I want to update something about this employee, and I'll say R because I want to give them a raise. And it did submit the page to give them a raise. Control/U, and I think it was D to change department, and I think it was Control/U T to terminate that employee. So those are all shortcuts that I could invoke. But by definition, those shortcuts aren't that discoverable. So it's important that we provide a vehicle for Apex to kind of display the shortcuts that are currently available on the page. So if we go to the upper right-hand corner and I expand this option here, you can see there's actually Alt-Shift-F1 is a way that I could even display this shortcut. So I didn't even realize that was something that I could do. So let me go ahead and say Alt-Shift-F1. Hey, look at that. My shortcuts just kind of pop up. And if I press my escape key, well, my escape key was supposed to close that. Looks like it didn't work. I got something to resolve there. But I should be able to close that dialog. I would like to take a brief look at how those shortcuts were populated. Notice that I just have a selector here that says display shortcuts added to my page. Okay, well, how was it populated with information? Well, again, you never know based on the current security or conditions on whether or not a component should be displayed. You don't necessarily want that bounded to your UI controls. You just want to say, oh, here are the things that I have available. Let me just show you the ones that I have. And your server will be in charge of keeping track of if it should display. And so here we go. We can see that we have this little method here called list shortcuts. And all I'm doing is I'm going to say for each one, I'm going to append a new value that says press some value or press a certain shortcut sequence to perform some action. And notice that here I added the shortcut display and to the page, and that was also included. If I was to add one more, and here's a super helpful shortcut that we could use, Alt-Shift-Down, kind of clone the line that I currently had selected. And I'll just put a 2 there, and I'll put a 2 there, and I'll just change this to F2, just so this is a slightly different shortcut. Save and run. Now when I open this, you can see that it shows my new shortcut. So I'm not just responding to I didn't have to change anything on the server necessarily to show any, or if I make a change to a component and it gets a new shortcut, this should happily update itself. So what do we discover about the actions interface? An action, we learned kind of what an action is and the different types of actions that we could perform. We were able to consolidate numerous buttons into a single menu. I talked about the advantages of using declarative components to enforce server-side conditions and security features. And we added shortcuts to simplify navigation. And the other thing is that when you're designing a user interface, you want to make sure that there are multiple paths to complete an action. There shouldn't just be one way to do it. Because you might have some set of users that want to do it, go follow one route, and another set of users that maybe really like to use their mouse and click. Maybe you have another set of users who maybe only want to use their keyboard. And so if you provide multiple paths to complete an action, then your application will just feel better to your users, regardless of how they like to use applications. Now, with that, I would like to hand the ball over to Dave for a moment.
Hey, thanks, Tyson. Yeah, look, you're here probably because you're an Apex developer and you want to learn a little bit more about making your applications user-friendly. So you've done some building. You may be at a point where you want some additional training. And we have 2 classes that are on the calendar coming up you might be interested in. The first is the intermediate Apex class. So this, of course, expects that you've got some Apex experience and might be just what you need. It's scheduled for November 29. It runs in half-day sessions, which we've found that the students have really liked. So you're not out of office or out of whatever for an entire day. The other class that you might be interested in, besides the intermediate, is the advanced Apex class. And yeah, this one's running in December, and you may find some benefit in that as well. Also, half-day sessions, I might add. Last but not least, there's been some questions, and it's come to my attention that not everybody is real familiar with the service that we are offering or know the service and know about the service we offer, managed Apex hosting in the cloud, of course. We host Apex applications in AWS or in Oracle Cloud. So we do all the infrastructure work. You have nothing to worry about there. We monitor it 24/7. It is designed for fully production, mission critical enterprise applications. We monitor it, make sure it's up. We ping it every 5 minutes or more if you need. So these are fully production ready environments. And you can have it on AWS or Oracle Cloud, whatever your preference is, and we can explain the pros and cons there. So it's a service we offer. Just want to make sure that you are aware of it. You bring your applications, we bring the infrastructure. We find it to be a really good mix. Thanks, Tyson. Appreciate the minute. Back to you.
All right. So thank you, everyone, for your time today. I don't know if we have any lingering questions in the, let me see here, add actions.
No, I think we're pretty good. Mike was looking for a button. I'm not sure he ever found that particular button, but I think he's good now.
Awesome.
There was a question about the builder itself. Oh, very good question. Thank you, Brian. The sample app. Yeah, it's available. I'll put the link right here, right now, and here. It's on the webinar page itself. I'm going to post the link right now into chat. You can download the sample app from the page that I've just posted in the chat. We will also make a tutorial from the session that Tyson just presented to us, and we will make a tutorial page on the website. We'll let you know when that video is available, and that sample app will be downloadable there as well.
I see there's a question that came in here, which was kind of, how do we get to the console? And I just, for everybody, just to show you, if for me on my computer and in Firefox, if I press F12, it will open up the console, or at least it'll open up the web developer tools. Some browsers that won't work. So you might have to use a different shortcut, which is Control-Shift-I, which should do the same thing. If for whatever reason that still is not working, under the menu options, I think it's under More Tools, there should be, there it is, Web Developer Tools. And when I select that, I get it to pop up. So this is a great example of there were 3 different paths to do the exact same thing. And so depending on the type of user and how they want to interact with something, it might feel intuitive to them or kind of where they want it to be.
Well, I was misunderstanding the nature of that question, the context. Thanks, Tyson. I'm glad you went back there and gave them the proper answer. Thank you. What was the first way on Firefox?
Oh, it's F12.
F12.
And if you're on a laptop, you might have to hold your function key and press F12, or go into your settings and toggle that.
Beautiful. Thanks, man.
All right. Well, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you so much for your time. Please stay safe and healthy out there, and happy apexing. We'll see you around.